So as Scott mentioned, I'm Kyrani Reneau. I work in the project management and user support unit here at ICPSR, and I spend some of my time working on the acquisitions team and also managing Open ICPSR, our self-publishing repository. And I'll let Brenae introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brenae Smith, and I work very closely with Kyrani on acquisitions primarily, and I'm a data project manager in the project management and user support unit as well.
Right. So today we are going to define data management, walk you through some of the benefits of good data management, and also give an overview of data management throughout the data lifecycle. And also we're going to take a really close look at data management plans, which is a big part of our jobs here at ICPSR. Then I'm going to give you a summary of what we've discussed. We're going to leave you with some wonderful ICPSR resources, and then there will be some time for some questions. So before I go to our definition of data management, I thought it'd be fun to hear from the audience when data management comes to mind. When you hear the words data management, what comes to mind? Just feel free to share those thoughts in the chat. We'd love to see what others are thinking when they hear data management. I can't click on the chat, but I see them popping up. I don't know if Brenae or Scott can read some of them out loud.
We've got massaging data, cleaning data, data dictionary, useful skills they'd like to learn, linking data sources together, and maintaining integrity, consistency, replicability. Brenae, I'm going to let you take over because you can say these words much cleaner than I can.
Yes, I also see data security and quality assurance, which metadata, all of these things are things that we will cover throughout the presentation.
Awesome. I love these responses so far. So let me bring up the definition then for everyone. So what is data management for those who might not be super familiar with it definition-wise? So it's a term used to describe the organization, storage, preservation, and sharing of data collected and used in a research project. So when it comes to research, data management is really about taking the timely steps to plan steps during the planning, collection, and analysis phases of a project to allow for data sharing for yourself and others and in a repository. So kind of the ultimate data management test is if you were to give your data to another scientist, would they be able to make sense of it? Some of the benefits of good data management are that it saves you time and money in the long run. So knowing and budgeting cost of processing and preserving data upfront means less headaches down the line for you. You'll be spending less time retroactively managing your data and more time actually conducting your research. It also helps to encourage transparency in the scientific process. And good data management also helps to prevent errors and increase the quality of your analyses. And it helps to enhance data security and minimize the risk of data loss. We'll be talking a bit about that later on. And it helps to meet funder journal requirements, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit as well. So I'm going to give an overview of data management throughout the data lifecycle. So this is as you can tell by the responses in the chat, this is a very large topic to cover. So we have chosen to focus on a very specific area, which is data management plans. But I'm sure with great interest of the other topics, and we'll see what types of questions come out of this presentation, perhaps we'll be able to host another ICPSR presentation based on interest on the different phases of the life cycle. So the figure on this slide kind of illustrates the key parts of archiving at each stage in the data creation process. The actual process, I would say, is not as linear as the diagrams suggest, but it's really important to develop a plan to address the archival considerations that come into play across all these stages. So in phase one, like I said, we will be focusing on this phase of this presentation, which is proposal development and data management plans. So I won't go into too much detail here since we'll be covering that in a bit. But like I said, in the earliest stages of proposal development, the data management planning and data sharing are all on the table. The next phase is project startup, excuse me. Once you received your funding and your project has started, that's when you will want to come up with the final form of collection, including metadata, which will be deposited in the archive. During this phase, you'll make decisions about data and file structure, naming conventions. So you'll be asking yourself things like, how will the files and variables be named? What will the data set documentation look like? And how will it be produced? A helpful tip is that doing pre-tests or pilot studies is a really good way to discover problems with your project early on. Next up is the data collection and file creation phase. Here is when it's especially critical to follow some best practices. And I will just share a few of those with you today. Like I said, we don't have time to cover it all, but some tips we have for you to avoid these different types of errors when creating your data set include separating the coding and the data entry tasks as much as possible, using a data entry program to catch typing errors. Another tip would be to perform double entry of the data where you have in which each record is keyed and then rekeyed against the original. Several standard packages already offer this. It might also be helpful in this phase to check the first about 10% of the data records and then check random records for quality control. And I'm going to mention a bit about metadata in this phase. So to prepare high quality metadata, ICPSR recommends using XML to create structured documentation that are compliant with the Data Documentation Initiative, otherwise known as DDI, which is an international metadata standard for data documentation and exchange. Some important metadata elements that are included in the social sciences are PI name, official title of the data collection, funding source, data producer, project description, sampling procedures, weighting, and more. And we have a full list of these elements in our guide to data preparation, which I'll be showing a screenshot of in a bit. The next phase is data analysis. So once you and your project staff are actively working with the data files, ICPSR has some things to keep in mind during this phase. So because additions, deletions, or other types of changes might be made to the data set, it's really good practice to maintain a master version of the data set that's stored on a read-only basis. It's really also important to set up your file structure appropriately. For most studies, this means rectangular files, but for studies, maybe perhaps storing larger data sets, hierarchical files might make more sense. In the next phase, so that is to prepare your data set for sharing. This is when, before doing so, it's really important to address respondent confidentiality, and we will be sharing some resources that will help you address that. Determining what file formats to share, using a standard stats package is definitely the most makes things most accessible. Also contacting your archive you plan to share your data with. And finally, phase 6, this is when you would actually be making your deposit and filling out required forms by the archive. This could be agreeing to the terms and conditions or any restricted data use agreements, and also complying with dissemination standards. So here's that guide I was talking about. This is an amazing resource we have. You might, for those familiar with ICPSR, you might already have relied on this guide, So in here really goes into more detail of the larger overview I just gave, and more tips for example, how to handle missing data, what to do with your variables for quantitative data. You know, it has great tips in here. So I highly recommend relying on this guide. So now we're going to move into data management plans. What is a data management plan? So this is a document describing the data you expect to collect and how you intend to manage, archive, and share those data. A DMP includes a description of types and formats of data, the repository you're going to be sharing your data with and why you chose that repository, as well as information about the informed consent process. People involved in a DMP are the research team, the PI, the funding agency, IRB, and the repository you're working with. When should you write your DMP? So it's really our recommendation to begin writing this when you're planning a new research project and writing a grant proposal. So at that very beginning of the data life cycle. And this might be us just saying, dotting your I's and crossing your T's, but even if it's not required for you to do so by a funder, we really recommend creating a DMP because it helps, you know, with research transparency and replication and reproducibility. So it's definitely something we recommend writing anyways. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of funding agencies are requiring these. So as of January 25th of next year, data management and sharing that plan will be required for all grant proposals going to NIH. We've created a new web page that outlines this policy and shares other important tips for the policy. And I will be showing a screenshot of that in a second. The NSF also has all proposals, including data management plans. We've shared their FAQs here. And also we've linked other larger agencies you might be familiar with that have these types of requirements as well. So here is the NIH data sharing page. You'll see that we link out to the policy specifically. We also have listed here ICPSR's topical archives that offer support for NIH funded data. We also, say how to designate ICPSR as a repository in an NIH data management and sharing plan. Again, we really suggest that you visit this page. It's a great resources and might answer a lot of your questions. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Brenae to take a deeper look at the elements of data management plans.
Great, thank you, Kyrani. So now that we have an overview of data management plans and what it involves, we'll get into some of the details of what that data management plan will entail. So there are different elements of a data management plan that are widely recommended by different funding agencies that they recommend to include in your plan. And so next we'll discuss some of these recommended elements of the DMP. So the first element that we would consider highly recommended is the data description. And this will be a brief description of the information to be gathered, including the scope, the nature, and the scale of the data. And the data description really helps reviewers to understand the characteristics of your data, their relationship to existing data, if any, and any disclosure risks that may apply. So in this example, you can see it describes a large-scale public use data set, and it refers to the size and its public use. So if your data were to include restricted data, you would want to mention the sensitive nature of the data here, and that it would require release through a restricted use agreement. So if you were to have ICPSR as your designated repository, we would recommend a sentence indicating that as such. So this last sentence of the example, it says these data, which will be submitted to ICPSR, fit within the scope of the ICPSR collection development policy, and a letter of support describing ICPSR's commitment to the data as they have been described as provided. So it's really important to, as Kyrani mentioned earlier, to contact the repository that you wish to work with ahead of time. So this would apply to any other repository that you would wish to designate. And this would happen before constructing your plan to ensure that their archival process and their data collection policy, et cetera, fit with your data and your funders' requirements. Next slide. Thank you. So our next recommended element is access and sharing. And this element will indicate how you intend to archive and share your data and why you have chosen that particular option. So this element is really important because it's backed by research that shows that when data are shared through an archive, research productivity increases, as well as the number of publications related to that data. So, and this is as opposed to when data are not shared. So this is a really important element and something that more and more funding agencies are requiring. So we have different options here that you can include. Of course, you can share through an archive like ICPSR or another archive of your choosing, which is what this first example includes guided text for. But another possible mechanism for archiving and sharing some people may choose is self-dissemination through a dedicated website that the research team creates and maintains. So we do provide example text for in the second example for self-dissemination. So it says the project team will create a dedicated website to manage and distribute the data because the audience for the data is small and has a tradition of interacting as a community. The site will be established using a content management system like Drupal or Joomla so that data users can participate in adding site content over time, making the site self-sustaining. The site will be available at the website, and for preservation, we will supply periodic copies of the data to a repository, and that repository will be the ultimate home for the data. So even if you are choosing to self-disseminate, you do want to designate a repository as well to preserve your data. Next slide. So next we will get into the metadata element, and this is another highly recommended element of the DMP. And this element answers the question of what types of metadata will you produce to support the data? Will a metadata standard be used, which is good practice? Good descriptive metadata are essential to effective data use and must provide all of the necessary information for accurate secondary analysis. So as you see here in this example, it describes what the metadata will contain, the format of the metadata, and the metadata standard to be used. So structured or tag metadata like the XML format of the DDI standard are optimal because the XML offers flexibility in display and is also preservation ready and machine actionable. And if you were to deposit your data with ICPSR, we adhere to this DDI standard as Kyrani mentioned previously. So the next element we'll look at is the intellectual property rights. And in order to disseminate data, archives need a clear statement from the data producer of who owns the data. So the principal investigator's university is typically considered to be the holder of the intellectual property rights for data the PI generates. As this example indicates, the principal investigators on the project and their institutions will hold the copyright for the research data they generate, but will grant redistribution rights to the repository for purposes of data sharing. So many archives do not ask for a transfer of rights, but will request instead permission to preserve and distribute the data. And that's what we follow here at ICPSR, and as well as many archives in the social sciences. And if there are any copyrighted instruments used to collect the data, this would also be addressed in this section. In that case, researchers should reach out to the archive in advance of the data deposit to discuss those copyright concerns. Okay, and so the next element is the ethics and privacy element, and this is another highly recommended element for your DMP. This element will address how you will handle informed consent with respect to communicating to respondents that the information they provide will remain confidential when data are shared or made available for secondary analysis. So this first example states that the informed consent language used for the study will not prohibit the data from being shared with the research community. Alternatively, you can include the language that will be used in your informed consent form, as this second example shows. And you can just include that exact language that you would use in your form for your respondents. And next slide. Okay. Additionally, if there are any legal constraints, for example, if there are constraints regarding HIPAA, you would address it here. So this example states that the investigators will provide documentation that an alteration or waiver of research participants' authorization for use or disclosure of information about them for research purposes have been approved by an IRB or a privacy board. And next we will discuss the format element. And this element includes the formats in which the data and supporting documentation will be generated and maintained and made available, as well as the reasoning and the appropriateness of the described formats. So depositing data and documentation and formats preferred for archiving can make the processing and release of the data faster and more efficient. So again, it is important to learn about the preferred formats of the archive that you wish to deposit with ahead of time by having those conversations early on, and learning about any additional options that they may have to accommodate your data. So as you can see in this example, they describe the formats of each data type that they plan to deposit, as well as the accompanying documentation and how the data will be stored. Next slide. Okay. Then the next element is archiving and preservation. And this is another important element of your DMP. Digital data need to be actively managed over time to ensure that they will always be available and usable. Preservation of digital information is widely considered to require more constant and ongoing attention than preservation of other media. So depositing data resources with a trusted digital archive like ICPSR can ensure that they are curated and handled according to good practices in digital preservation. So this element addresses how you will ensure that the data are preserved for the long term. It will also address plans if the archiving entity were to go out of existence. So here's a quick generic text that you may include when you're planning to deposit with an archive. So by depositing with said archive, our project will ensure that the research data are migrated to new formats, platforms, and storage media as required by good practice. So in this second example, this can be used in the case of if your plans are to self-disseminate. Even if the data will live on your website and you plan to store a copy of the data on an internal drive of some sort, it's best practice to also designate an archive that adheres to those archiving and preservation guidelines for long-term safeguard of your data. So in the second example text, it states, in addition to distributing the data from a project website, future long-term use of the data will be ensured by placing a copy of the data into the repository, ensuring that best practices in digital preservation will safeguard the files. Next slide. Next, we have storage and backup, and this will describe the storage methods that include cyber storage as well as physical storage. So this is important because digital data are more fragile, and best practice for protecting them is to store multiple copies in multiple locations, whether that's cyber or physical. In our sample text, we have that the repository will place a master copy of each digital file in archival storage, with several copies stored at designated locations and synchronized with the master through the storage resource broker, also known as the SRB, which is a common way that this is achieved. And next, we will briefly go through some additional recommended elements of the data management plan. These won't include the examples, but I will show you a resource that we have online that will include examples for each of these elements. So the first additional recommended element would be existing data. So a survey of existing data relevant to your project and a discussion of whether and how these data will be integrated. So this is important because data management plans value the new data collection that comes from its relationship to existing data sources. So they do want to indicate what those existing sources are. Next, security. This is a description of the technical and procedural protections for information, including any confidential information, how permissions or restrictions or delayed disseminations or embargoes will be enforced. Next, we have responsibility, and that addresses the question of who will act as the responsible steward for the data throughout the data life cycle. So typically, data are owned by the institution awarded at the federal grant, and the principal investigator who oversees the research data would own the data throughout the project period. So that's who the responsibility would fall under. And then next we have the audience. So this describes the audience for the data you produce, and this comes into play when the audience for the data may influence how the data are managed or shared. For example, when audience are beyond the academic community who may use the research data. And lastly, the selection and retention periods. This is where you'll indicate how data will be selected for archiving. So how long will the data be held? What your plans are for eventual transition or termination of the data collection in the future. And next slide. So these are some possible additional requirements that may be required for your DMP. It just will depend on your data, the funding agency, and how much you should include to supplement the rest of your DMP. So of course, budget information is often included in the budget justification of your proposal, but it may also be important to include in your DMP just to contain it in a collective document, and it may inform other parts of the DMP. So this addresses the cost of preparing the data and documentation for archiving and how these costs will be paid. And any request for funding may be included here as well. So here's another reason to reach out to your archive that you wish to work with ahead of time to learn about the costs of archiving with them. And so the next additional element would be data organization. And here you will indicate how the data will be managed during the project, with information about version control, naming conventions, etc. It's important to describe these situations in which research data are in some way atypical with respect to how they'll be organized. So, for example, some data collections are dynamically changing, and version control is central to how the data will be used and understood by the scientific community. Next, we have quality assurance, which can be an important element to include as well. It's certainly important to be transparent about with respect to data quality measures across the data lifecycle. So here you want to specify how you will ensure that the data meet quality assurance standards. And lastly, we have the legal requirements, which this will indicate whether any legal requirements apply to your archiving and sharing your data. This can relate to HIPAA and copyrighted materials, at which we discussed earlier and may be covered in other areas, but certainly if they were not covered, it would be important to include them in this section. And next, you will see on your screen a sample data management plan. And this is on our website under the data management tab. And if you go to the overview and under the access section, you'll see data management plans, and it'll have all of our resources related to data management plans. And this is a sample data management plan specifically if you were archiving with ICPSR. So we have the language, the sample language that you would use with respect to ICPSR. So that's a really good resource, and many researchers use this as a template for starting their DMP if they're archiving with ICPSR. And next, which I find really useful as well, is the framework for creating a data management plan. And this is found under the same tab under our website. And this will break down each element, what it means, and why it's important, and give multiple examples of different scenarios for each case that you may be working under. So this is a really good resource for different examples if you may have an abnormal case that you want specific examples for. So again, these can both be found on our ICPSR website under data management.
Great. Thanks, Brenae, for walking us through that. Those were wonderful details. And we just really hope that from our presentation today, it's apparent that data management is a really huge and important part of the research lifecycle. So I want to just give a summary of what we went over. So as we've emphasized, making that DMP early on and making sure all those required elements are part of that is important. Really initiating the process early on helps you conduct your research more efficiently. And I wanted to leave us with and reemphasize some of the benefits of data sharing, which includes the fact that it helps generate diversity of perspectives and different uses for your data. It helps to increase the profile of the data producers. As we've mentioned here today, it helps protect confidentiality and also provides long-term preservation and sustainability. So the actions you take today to organize your research can really help the future you feel more in control of your research project and makes it easier to share your results with others. While I know it's good to implement data management techniques early, there might be roadblocks or limitations to doing so. So we are here to help. We offer reviews of DMPs. We also provide letters of support for grant applications from ICPSR indicating support for archiving your data with us. We are able to meet with you to discuss your deposit or your data and share the deposit options with you. So on this slide, you'll see a screenshot of our collections. We have 23, I believe, 23 collections, which are topical archives within ICPSR. These collections are sponsored by different agencies who pay for the curation of the data. And these collections house data related to different topics, such as child and family data, health and medical data, addiction and HIV data, and much, much more. So we are able to work with you and the different archive managers to find the best and most appropriate home for your data to really make it available and to secondary users, and the usage increases. And lastly, once your data are made available through ICPSR, we do provide post-release ongoing study support. Finally, we wanted to leave you with some resources up top here. These first 3 bullets, you'll see ones related to DMPs, and Brenae shared some screenshots of that as well. And finally, other resources. We recently created a top 5 ICPSR resources video that has QR codes that will take you directly to our wonderful resources on our site. We have that NIH, sharing NIH funded data page, our FAQs related to depositing, and also our YouTube channel. So we again want to thank you for joining us today. You're able to reach us at these emails on the screen, our help desk, which will answer any questions. That's icpsr-help@umich.edu, or to reach the acquisitions team directly, you can reach us at icpsr-acq@umich.edu. So I think now we will have some time for a Q&A.
We have a question here that asks, do separate collections like NACJD offer different support for DMPs, or is there an overall ICPSR group for the How We Can Help list?
Yeah.
So
Brenae, you want to take that one?
yeah, we would definitely recommend, if you know that you want to archive with NACJD, you can reach out to them directly. Our sample DMPs are, our general samples for working with ICPSR, but NACJD, of course, is one of our topical archives. So the data would be curated by the funder. So that would alter some of the elements in your DMP. So like the budget or the access level, which would make, since the funder is curating the data, that would make it free to the public. So there are different access levels that would pertain or relate to different archives. Well, the topical archives versus just the general archive. So we would recommend reaching out to the specific archive if you are looking at their funding agency and would like to archive with them, just so that they can answer more specific questions.
We have another asking whether there is a plan to assist institutions that want to establish or implement data management plans.
Good. Oh, Scott, could you repeat the question? They're asking for assistance with establishing data management plans. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, whether there's a plan to assist institutions that want to implement data management plans.
Okay. That's a wonderful question. I think that's not one I've gotten before, but I think we can definitely take that back to our acquisitions director and reply to this person with a response. But I don't, I'm sure that's definitely something we'd be interested in doing, since we're, as we emphasize in the talk, more agencies are requiring these types of things, and we do offer support generally to individual researchers.
Yes, and our sample data management plan is certainly a great place to start, and we do offer the resource of reviewing your data management plan. So as far as an institution-wide data management plan, we would want to look into that further just to make sure it fulfills requirements and would be useful for all the researchers at your institution, but yeah, we can definitely look into that more.
We have one asking, how do you plan for the ownership of the data if the PI retires or dies?
Well, in terms of this is another also very great question. So I think this might be a good one for our privacy officer to answer, and we'll have to get back to this person. But Brenae, have we come across this before when a PI passes?
Yeah, I'm not thinking of anything off the top of my head, but I'm sure we do have something in place for this that we will just need to look into further. But we can, if you reach out to the acquisitions team with your question, we can definitely look into that for you.
What I can say is that we this might not answer the copyright issue. I think it was related to copyright, but we do back up in 5 different locations that are digitally and physical too. I see some comments in the chat. Someone said that would likely apply as a standard copyright question and about who owns the copyright if they die. But we, yes, as Brenae said, we will definitely find out more if we have more, a more thorough response for that person. Any other questions?
And we'll make sure that we have these resources and our contact information listed in the follow-up email following this webinar so that you have all of that information.
We did get another question asking if ICPSR provides mentorship for individuals aiming to set up consulting agency in LDCs.
So I know LDC is least developing countries, I think, least developed countries. So what types of, I'm wondering what you mean by consulting agency. We definitely just generally to our researchers from any institution. If you're planning to deposit with us, we do provide outreach calls and a range of different support services. So I can answer that portion of it, but something like for not. Oh, sorry, Brenae.
And it looks like we're getting some information from our fellow ICPSR
Oh, I didn't see that.
yeah, staff members, and they're saying that unfortunately we do not offer that type of mentorship. But again, to echo Kyrani, we do offer other types of support.
Right. Do we have any more?
We have one saying that one thing I've struggled with is recording metadata in XML files. I've located XML metadata templates, but adding the metadata in a text editor is clunky due to the large number of fields that just don't feel applicable to my projects. Is there anything I could do or resources I can use to make the metadata logging process go more smoothly?
That's a really good question. I do see, I'm glad we have greatly supportive colleagues on the call. I do see Catherine Lavender on the call, who is a great expert in this area. So if we're not able to get a detailed answer, we will share somewhere where you can go. That might be a good starting point. So we're going to share the Collectica DDI resource with everyone in the chat here. And the DDI Alliance is also a great resource. We work with them closely, so we would recommend starting there as well. Thank you, Catherine. All right. Don't see any more questions, so I think people are starting to leave. But again, we want to thank you for joining us and for your greatly interesting questions. Like I said, I know, Scott, this presentation will be shared, correct? All right.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Kyrani and Brenae, for the presentation. We'll try to get this recording up end of this week, early next week. We'll also send the slides over. I'm going to try to send the slides. We had a Blalock lecture in August about the NIH data sharing policy specifically. So I'll try to get those slides to all of you as well, since there's probably a good overlap of interest. But yeah, thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.